Right. And so, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Rob O'Connor, editor here at Infrastructure Intelligence. Let's get to this. Start this again. Hello, I'm Rob O'Connor. Sorry about that. I'm editor here at Infrastructure Intelligence. And welcome to the latest in our series of Infrastructure Intelligence live events, which as ever has been organised in association with our Events and Communications strategic partner, BECG. Now, we've had literally dozens of webinars over the last couple of years, covering a huge range of hot topics. And the question of communications always pops up, with people thinking construction could often do a lot more to get its positive messages across. So we decided to do something about it. And we're delighted to have 4 of the industry's top PR and communication specialists here with us today to give us their own insights in how to best reach a range of different audiences. But before I introduce our first speaker this morning, can I just remind everyone watching that you are very welcome to ask any questions in the chat button, which should be somewhere down at the bottom of your screen there, and we'll try and address your points as we go along. But first, what does our panel think? Basically, our first speaker today is Alicia De Haldivang. Alicia is a communication specialist at Stantec with a focus on climate change, energy, engineering, infrastructure, and water. She's been at Stantec for over a year as its UK Public Relations Manager and is transitioning into a role focusing on communications in climate change and ESG in community development. Starting in journalism before moving into marketing and communications, she's worked in oil and gas, HSC, nuclear, offshore wind, infrastructure, and rail, both in the Middle East and in Europe. She's worked on net zero campaigns, climate change campaigns, including around last year's COP26. She's also worked on diversity, inclusion initiatives and national energy consortiums. Alicia is passionate about renewables and also volunteers at an onshore wind and solar farm in Wiltshire. Now, she herself says that a boat trip to Rampion offshore wind farm will always be one of the best days of her life. And who are we to disagree on that one? So I think it's fair to say that Alicia probably knows everything there is to know about PR in that sort of circumstances. So, and she's been talking today about dealing with a client audience, I believe. So, with that, Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. So I'm going to be talking about client, and I thought I'd just set out 4 key pointers in terms of client communications. And so the first one is getting your comms teams involved from the outset. From the moment there is a big bid, from the moment project milestones start coming through, we need to be on board. We can help shape the narratives, ascertain who and where and when the communication should be going out there. So things like frameworks where there's very clear comms guidance work really well. So in terms of, because it means that technical teams and communications teams work together from the very beginning. In my experience, I've worked on a series of nuclear consortiums, and that just gave me direct access to the engineers, the architects, the designers building nuclear power stations. And just in terms of communications, I was there and I had the information at the very start. It also means that we can pool resources, we can share different bits of content. Some teams might have a bigger budget than others. So it means that we can share more content across different websites. We can also share ideas. And it means that it's just, if we get us in earlier, it's so much more than just a press release and move on. It also means we can get to have ideas of different outlets, and also diverse different outlets as well. So, for example, I worked on with an oil and gas team, and they did a project on a whiskey distillery. So we pitched that story with the client to a whiskey magazine. And I never thought I'd say this on a webinar, but one of my latest PR joys was Harry Styles launching his new album with Better Homes and Gardens magazine, which I thought was pretty cool. So the second point is about representation. We have to make sure we are showcasing all the brains that we have within our organizations. Think about co-authoring. Think about co-authoring with clients as well. Can we set some targets? Can we monitor all our authors as well to make sure we're getting, it's not just the same voices, but we're allowing that other expertise. This is particularly important, I find, within STEM campaigns as well. Representation absolutely matters. Then third point is empowering people to communicate. We work with some incredibly smart people, and we have to factor in the personalities of the people who work with. Some people might not be that confident to author something or to post on social media. So we as comms people have to give them that confidence to share that information. So two of our social media managers, they create every week a social media action email where we've got photos, exact hashtags, suggested copy. People can absolutely copy and paste, and it's just as much about empowering people to communicate as much as giving them the message and as providing the message. It also links into the nature of brands. A friend of mine works for a very big British brand, and I remember him saying to me, it usually is okay because a journalist, because of the nature of who I work for, a journalist will usually pick up the phone to me. Not all brands have that luxury. So we have to encourage people to sell the story, tell them positive news stories themselves. And not necessarily wait for a corporate social media post to go out there. Not necessarily rely on the comms teams to go out there as well. But I think we all have a responsibility to share the good projects that they're working on. And then my final point comes about narratives. And I come at this from very much a climate change and environmental perspective. Perhaps there's a narrative that at the moment of if I do something good for the environment, then I lose out personally. So how, with our language and working with clients, how do we bring out those environmental and social impacts? How do we get people to care about the work that we're doing? And I think actually infrastructure is at the forefront because of the nature of what we do. We can see the buildings that we're doing. We're walking on the roads every single day. So how do we get people to care about that work, focus on it? And that's through the language that we use. Make it easy, make it understandable. Don't make it patronizing or make people feel guilty. And that also links into the role of communications within ESG reporting. We'll see, we see lots of coverage about the E part, but less so about the social part. It's harder to quantify things about sense of place and belonging, what makes home, what makes safety, what's safe. It's harder to quantify. So that's where it comes back into my point about representation. Are we making sure that we're sharing all the voices of people working on the projects? Are we sharing the voices by the people impacted on the projects to then bring those good stories, those good statistics, those positive projects to light? And that's me. So back to you, Rob.
Thanks, Alicia. That was absolutely fantastic. Lots of good news to take in there about the getting in there early, shaping the narrative, being proactive. All good stuff, I think. Now, let's have a look. Our second speaker today is Joe Field. Joe is the founder and chief executive of JFG Communications, a public affairs and PR consultancy specializing in diversity and decarbonisation for the transport, infrastructure and construction sectors. Joe's got almost 20 years of experience in helping companies engage their stakeholders, build advocacy for their plans, and inform and influence public policy. She was listed amongst the 100 most influential and inspirational women in Westminster earlier this year, and was named Public Affairs Consultant of the Year in 2021. She previously worked at Transport for London. She's also the president of Women in Transport, and is hugely passionate about addressing women's underrepresentation in the transport, infrastructure, and construction workforces. So I think once you got your breath back from all of that, I think it's fair to say that Joy is a top industry PR. And today she'll be talking about engaging with communities and dealing with the actual real people. Imagine that. So Jo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. Hi, everyone. So yeah, what I'm going to talk about is some of the common themes that come up in my work through research, and something that I'm always hearing is that the construction sector offers really exciting projects to work on. It creates jobs, it creates growth, it delivers social value to communities, but it needs to get better at shouting about the great work it is doing. So what I'm going to talk about are working with the stakeholders and communities that are impacted by your works, and how you can create positive relationships with stakeholders to amplify your message. So I'm going to cover two things really. So first of all, it's why is stakeholder engagement important? And then I'm going to give you 5 top tips for successful stakeholder engagement. So first of all, why stakeholder engagement is important. And something that I think is often overlooked in construction and infrastructure projects, you know, because we always talk about solving engineering challenges and coming up with innovations, but we don't always talk about the people and, you know, who are we building these projects for? Like whether it's transport or housing or hospitals, these projects are all about people. We're constructing them for people. So you have to think about the customer or the end user and the communities that you're impacting along the way. This means you have to bring people with you on the journey, and communities have to help shape the project. And that's why you need comms. In the case of the transport and infrastructure projects that my team and I work on, you know, we do a lot of new projects, major projects and smaller ones. And many of these projects literally won't happen unless you get the communications and stakeholder engagement right, because they need public support and they need stakeholder cheerleaders to enable them to get the planning approvals needed to go ahead. And to give you a topical example that everyone's been talking about recently, the Elizabeth line, which I'm sure many people on this call worked on, and you know, everyone was really happy to see it launch a few weeks ago. But if you think about it, Crossrail took a lot of time to come to fruition. It was first proposed in the 1940s, but construction didn't start until 2009. Because decision-making on some of these major projects, you know, it's down to political will, it needs the support of politicians, and because it takes time, what you actually need are communities and stakeholders to keep making the case, of why we need these schemes, and so that support will help to sustain the project's life across political cycles, across changes of government, local and national. Crossrail, just to carry on with the example, Crossrail came to fruition finally because it had the backing of business stakeholders. Business stakeholders were willing to campaign for it and to pay their share of the costs. So moving on to my 5 top tips for successful stakeholder and community engagement. So number 1 is to identify your stakeholders. What you need to do is to make sure you know which groups are going to be impacted by your project and who has an interest in the project. And what you should do is map their positions of interest and influence on a parent interest grid to help you focus your engagement activity and work out where to prioritize your efforts. Number 2 is to develop your plans in partnership with your stakeholders. Local people know which schemes will work best for their communities and how they would like to be engaged. So you need to make sure that stakeholder feedback informs your strategy, and true engagement is about co-creating your projects and your communications in partnership with your stakeholders. Top tip number 3 is to engage early and often. So you should reach out to your stakeholders and community groups early in the project and enable them to shape the proposals. So this is all about two-way dialogue, transparency, active listening, and true engagement is different from consultation. Of course, you absolutely need consultation because it's large scale and it gets you lots of people's views. Engagement is a bit more focused and qualitative and in-depth, and it's truly two-way. It's essentially about having an equal partnership between the organization and its stakeholders. And engagement is about everyone working together to achieve shared objectives. Tip number 4 is to build stakeholder advocacy. So what you should be aiming to do is to partner with trusted stakeholders on joint campaigning and media relations activity. So this is where your stakeholders carry your messages in their own communications. So whether that's a business group, a charity, a residents association, a community group, a disabled people's organisation, you want to work with these stakeholders to carry your messages. And they could do this privately in conversations with government and elected representatives, or they could do it publicly on their social media and other channels such as newsletters. And crucially, stakeholders will be much more likely to champion a project that they have co-created with you and been involved from the start. And my top tip number 5 is to be an advocate for your stakeholders. So if you want your stakeholders to champion your project, you know, advocacy is a two-way street, essentially. You need to be an advocate for your stakeholders as well. So what we do as comms professionals, as stakeholder engagement professionals, we're going out, we're talking to stakeholders and communities, we're working in partnership with technical teams, but we are often the people that are getting the intelligence needed to shape a project, to shape proposals. So we need to bring that back to the project team or internally to champion the stakeholders' views to the right people at the right time to make sure that stakeholders are listened to and that your organisation responds. And this, of course, helps to build trust and relationships over time. Thank you. And now back to you, Rob.
Right, thanks very much for that, Jo. Some fantastic points there about engaging with communities at the earliest possible stages, using them to help, well, just making sure that projects get delivered well. I was going to say on time, but you mentioned the Elizabeth line as an example, but nonetheless, a huge project which needed community and stakeholder backing all the way. So there's plenty of good stuff there. So it's fantastic. Right, our third speaker today is none other than Emily Ashwell. Now, Emily is Communications Manager at infrastructure consultancy ACOM, primarily working on media relations for the company. At ACOM, she works on PR around the firm's big strategies such as ESG and digital, as well as promoting its technical and project work. Now, Emily's background is in journalism, and she works as a writer and editor for more than 20 years, starting off as a cub reporter on a regional daily paper before moving into the business press, and she most recently worked on an infrastructure and sector title. So basically, we receive news and opinion pieces from Emily on a regular basis. So we know ourselves just how good she is. So today, she'll be giving us a unique insights on all things PR. So Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm here this morning to talk about corporate communications and how industry can promote positive messages. So I work at ACOM, and it's a global consultancy. And one of the key elements of delivering a communications campaign is that before any company or industry goes live with a campaign, there's a huge amount of work to be undertaken behind the scenes to agree messaging and achieve buy-in from different parts of the business or industry. So in a large matrixed organisation such as ACOM, that takes work, as it would do for the wider industry. And this is where communications plays a really important role in helping stakeholders to see the bigger picture and understanding the importance of wider messaging rather than this messaging being siloed specifically around their own work stream or business. Once stakeholder buy-in has been achieved, it's much easier to present a united front. And when messaging has been agreed, it needs to be across the business from top to bottom. So for example, when we're running an external campaign, this will often be complemented by other work in the business, such as account managers having specific messaging on the issue for their clients. At ACOM, one of the key parts of my job is getting the business to understand how we can support growth. So that's understanding that PR isn't just about cutting ribbons and saying how great we are, but it's about how we influence in a strategic way to demonstrate what we can do and also drive wider behaviours in industry, such as the importance of decarbonisation. And then as we begin to build back better after the pandemic, in terms of the industry getting credit for what it does, I think that companies and industry increasingly has to demonstrate what they stand for, what their values are, as well as what they do. So clients and stakeholders want to trust that the firms they are working with share their values. The more we're seen as an industry which does the right thing, the more people will see that our impact on the built environment and the design choices we make have the right motivations behind them. And at Acorn, one of the ways we do this is by demonstrating how we integrate our values throughout the company in our project work as well as operations. So whether that's publicising the decarbonisation targets we've set ourselves, talking about how they're externally verified and how we'll achieve them, or our communications work to push the importance of infrastructure projects which support wider issues such as equity and levelling up, such as our work done to promote HS2. So having listened to three of us already, I'm sure you'll appreciate that communication is a huge area, but I think the value we can bring is in helping to shape and create messaging, getting stakeholder buy-in, and as well as the execution of campaigns. So again, this is adding value by telling stories in a compelling way and helping to make the industry more attractive to potential employees, clients, and other stakeholders. So thank you very much for listening, and back to you, Rob.
That's better. I was on, got the old mute button working. Emily, thanks very much for that. That was absolutely fantastic. Lots of fantastic points there on all the work that goes in preparing a PR campaign before any, actual sort of it faces out, any sort of campaign faces outwards. Lots of stuff about great points about strategic influence, driving net zero, emphasizing the values of a company and doing the right thing and getting people on board. Lots of things to think about later when we have a chat. And I think now, so it's time now though to welcome our final speaker for the morning. Is none other than James Bird. Now, James is a board director for the hugely influential Cavendish Advocacy, and also for SoCrowd, which is a social media management platform. Now, Cavendish is part of the BECG group, which for nearly 20 years has been helping clients with their political and corporate communications, both nationally and internationally. And the group was recognised as the #1 public affairs consultancy in PR Week's top 150 UK PR consultancies this year. Now, James has over 15 years experience in comms. A former BBC journalist. He's also been a Birmingham City Councillor before moving into government relations. Basically, he's also worked around the government's 10-point plan for the green industrial revolution. So with that, I think it's fair to say that you could write what James doesn't know about working with government and policymakers on the back of a stamp. So it's a good job he's here today with us to talk about getting construction's message across within government circles. So James, I would say welcome to the table, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you to the other speakers. Interesting to listen from Alicia, Emily and Joe. Some really interesting points there, and hopefully I won't repeat anything that everyone's already said, but my focus is on government relations. And how both businesses and industry can get the message across to this audience and wider political stakeholders effectively. And I think I want to focus on 3 areas which I think are crucial. First is making sure that your narrative is right for the policy agenda of today, but also tomorrow. And then being seen to add value to the agenda. So not just going in with an ask of government, but actually adding value to the wider agenda itself. And the final point really is what I touch on is the confidence levels in the industry. So being confident and creative in getting the message across. So just starting with getting the narrative right. We want to align the narrative that you're talking about with the government and the opposition's thoughts. So what's the government focused on? We know it's focused on levelling up. We know it's focused on sustainability, the economy and the cost of living, with a hint of Brexit lingering on under there. But the government needs to see that its policies on those areas are actually working on the ground, and it needs to demonstrate success. And the construction industry is crucial to this. if you look at each of those areas, there's a really good story to tell. So if you take levelling up, we recently did a survey with MPs on what does successful levelling up look like. And the top answer was regeneration of local high streets. This was followed by increased job opportunities. And the third was improved local infrastructure and transportation links. Now, all those areas, construction has a massive say in, and it's right to be talking about the success that construction has on the ground. And again, if you look at sustainability, there's a real challenge for the government in terms of hitting its target, its net zero target by 2050. And the construction industry is crucial to that, providing answers in terms of reducing housing and building emissions with better heat pumps, MMC, insulation. And on the economy, construction is spending more now than ever on research and development, all of which will hopefully help with the economy and the cost of living. So what the industry needs to do is provide opportunities for site visits, tours, briefings, news stories, and getting data out, which tells the story of government, but also informs the opposition about what opportunities there are. If you can do that, if you can match that narrative, then the construction industry will get a really positive message across. The second bit that I wanted to touch on is being seen to add value to the wider agenda. And what I mean by that is that quite often we have clients that want to go in front of government and they've got an ask. And often it's the first time they go in front of government. And if you go with an ask straight away, it's quite a cold start. It's a very transactional relationship. So too much messaging really is based on trying to secure something for the industry. But the way I deal with the clients is actually, I think that what you need to look at is a bit further down the line. So you need to look at what the government's thinking about. The government is looking for answers to problems, not problems to answer. And that's really important. They're looking for solutions to tomorrow's agenda. So, when we look at the areas and the mega trends that are going on in the world, ethical supply chains, automation, urbanization, these are areas which the government's interested in, and the construction industry has solutions and can talk about them. So another piece of advice here really is start looking at the future and what solutions there are that you can push to government. And that might be through working with think tanks or universities or doing polls, whatever it might be, but have that evidence base to put in front of government. And what you will do is create a much warmer relationship than going in with an ask. And the final point I wanted to touch on is creativity and having confidence. Confidence is a big thing in comms, and it's absolutely boiling hot today. And I can pretty much guarantee that in the papers tomorrow, there will be headlines such as Britain's railway lines buckle under the heat as Spain looks fine. Tarmac on the roads melts away, but not in France. There'll always be criticisms of the industry. And I think there has been a bit of a crisis of confidence, particularly around things like building safety, the length of time it takes to complete projects like Crossrail, ongoing costs that spiral out of control. And it's amplified by the fact that we have lots of social media warriors, news gets out quicker. But my final thought on this is don't get stuck being reactive. Make sure there's a proactive plan of comms. Because in the end, if you don't talk about the good work that you're doing, it won't get out there because no one else will do it for you. So don't be taken back by criticism, keep a proactive approach, and keep speaking about the great things that are happening. Thanks, Rob. Back to you.
Okay, thanks for that, James. Absolutely fantastic, and especially the positive message at the end about being proactive and not being waylaid by whatever tittle tattle and nonsense on social media, and really getting hold of the agenda and driving it forward. So lots to think about and take in there. Just a reminder to everyone listening that you're very welcome to pop a message in the chat, ask any comments, and I'll relay them straight back to the panelists. I've got something from Alice Edwards. With construction projects increasingly being asked to show they are providing social value, does the panel have any tips for communicating social value? And I think we'll start with Joe on that one. Sorry, Joe, for springing that on you.
No, that's fine. I just couldn't get off mute there. Thank you. Yeah, actually I do. I've got a good example. This is from a project that I worked on with our clients, Skanska Costain Strabag joint venture, working on HS2. And it's an amazing social value project called Empowering Communities. So it's a social legacy project for construction of HS2 in London. So it's enabling communities across the route into London to benefit from social value, such as employment opportunities, helping young people, helping people who are experiencing homelessness, and also inclusive communities. And basically it's bringing together all the construction companies that are working on the HS2 route in London. So that's Costain, Skanska, Strabag, Mace, Dragados, Arup, also Network Rail, and with HS2 as an equal partner. And it is great because it's working with local communities to come up with the solutions and enabling local people to have a say in what the project is delivering for them. And so I worked on the launch. So obviously, you know, I think people don't argue with social value. Everyone can see the benefits it brings. So I always think this should be the leading narrative of any project. But it's, you know, it's how do you get that message across? So when I worked on the launch of Empowering Communities, some of the things we did to make sure the message got out was to have high profile speakers. So we were able to secure the HS2 minister and also the chief executive of HS2, Mark Thurston. So we had Andrew Stevenson speaking, and that endorsement from Andrew Stevenson was really great. The event itself, we had a mixture of industry professionals, but also community projects that were benefiting from the programme. And then we worked with stakeholders to secure advocacy and to amplify the messages. And one of the stakeholder groups we worked with was the CBI, because they have been campaigning for social value to be embedded in procurement frameworks so that it's, you know, it's not just a nice to have, it's something that you do actually have to deliver. So having that added advocacy from the CBI and other stakeholders really helped to get the message across.
Yeah. So basically social value is a must have, isn't it, really, in this or any other day and age. Absolutely. If I can go straight to Emily with the same sort of question in terms of, obviously ACOM is involved in a huge range of projects and things. So do you have any examples of communicating social value, or do you have any tips for communicating the benefits of, you know, positive social value? And I will come to the other panelists in turn as well. So I can feel the brains wearing already.
Yeah, I mean, obviously ACOM's a huge company, and therefore we do have a strategy around social value. And when communicating about it, that means that sort of like we, you know, identify the points we want to make, the messaging, etc., etc. But what I would say is first of all, spell it out, spell the social value out. People don't necessarily make the connection that because there's a new rail line or something, the impact that has on communities and lives. So when you're doing your communications, writing a press release, etc., make it obvious. And then and perhaps going back to what James was saying earlier, any data around that as well really helps. And then in terms of projects on the ground, think about the wider project work as well. And I think this is where it can be difficult communicating projects in that there's often lots of stuff going on, lots of great stuff going on in terms of ecology, or, you know, there might be some sort of the side element of the project that's like a soft sud scheme or sort of something that really benefits communities, but it's the project team being sort of ready and comfortable to talk about it. So it's being close to the project teams and holding their hands through it, so that we can get to a point where we can talk about that kind of thing.
Right, thanks very much for that, Emily. Alicia, same thing about you, but I mean, you know, do you have any tips for communicating social value? I'm thinking that particularly that, well, obviously huge companies, so you're looking at sort of meeting social value targets a company might have, but actually more, you know, as importantly, if not more so, is actually dealing with people on the ground, communities themselves that, you know, hopefully set to benefit from positive social value.
Yeah, I think so I agree with everything that Emily said. I don't want to repeat that, but I think there's two elements of within social value, as I said before, sometimes it's harder to measure, but where we can use toolkits and they are more developing, then reference that so others have that opportunity to access those toolkits. But I think, yes, Rob, it's about bringing out those stories from the people impacted. So, for example, working on a scheme where it's bringing in lots of e-bikes around the area. So the idea is, the story is we're going to be speaking to the residents who use it, not necessarily the people who have implemented the projects themselves, because it's about the people who are using it. It's all very well saying positive, yes, we've got X amount of bikes, but if no one's using them, then it's not necessarily that positive a story. So I think it's about focusing on the people who are directly impacted from a project and not essentially taking the limelight away from them, giving them a voice to say how they feel about that community or that new development.
Yeah, that's great points about, focusing on people, because at the end of the day, it's all about people, isn't it, really? So social value and the benefits it brings to them. James, if I can come to you with the same question about, sort of tips for communicating social value. I mean, obviously dealing with government in government circles, you're looking at sort of, it's a good political, it's a win-win politically speaking for anyone, isn't it, to say, right, we are doing this and this benefits people by X, Y, Z. So if you'd like to expand on that, then that would be great.
I think on some developments, it can always seem as quite controversial, so particularly housing in certain areas, and social values a good way of politicians communicating the wider benefit to a local area. What I would say is, looking at it from when I was a local councillor, is get in early with the local community and understand what their needs are and what they would like to see from it, because there's different social values. Should not be we have a suite of different ideas, we're going to force it upon you. It has to be the other way around. Is what do you think we should do? How can we help? Let people provide the ideas back, and you get really early buy-in for that, and keep it local as best you can, and innovative. The one thing I would say from a corporate perspective is don't get lost on shouting about when you've done it and what the measurements look like. So it doesn't just stop when you finish the project. The idea is it carries on as a legacy. So make sure that you do talk about that. Right.
Thanks, James, and thanks to Alice for the question. Just as I said, we've still got lots and lots of people listening to us this morning. Got a little here. Stephen Curry, I think the MP for North East Somerset, wonder who that might be, might disagree with social value. Procurement is about value, not values. But everyone's entitled to their own opinion, I suppose. Now, basically, we've still got a lot of people with us on this boiling hot day, so thanks for everyone for sticking with us. We've got another 15-20 minutes to go, I think. But feel free to add any sort of other questions you might want to ask the panel. Sort of in our chat box there, and it could cover anything from net zero, diversity, inclusion, how to reach different audiences. You pick a subject, and our panel are very happy to speak about it, even though they don't know about it yet. I've got a little question up my sleeve in terms of strategic influence in PR. I'm thinking that basically, following on from what particularly James and Alicia might have said earlier, and Emily as well, in terms of a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. You get the feeling that a lot of work is basically a lot of comms work and PR work is actually physically unseen and not necessarily seen by the public. So basically, I'm just wondering if Emily could expand on that in terms of like the importance of getting things right behind the scenes before you get out there, and get the importance of getting everyone on board, really.
Yeah, absolutely. At ACOM, the area that I specialise in is media relations, and as you'll appreciate, Rob, it's a very different thing when you have sort of people in a company who want to say something and what they want to say, and then as a media relations professional, you have the news editor who has that publications agenda, and it's sort of how you marry the two. So often, piece of communications will start with sort of a call with the project team, talking about the project, thrashing out ideas and themes and that kind of thing. And then sort of I'll do some thinking and well, where will this fit? Where's a good place to pitch? And sort of what are the messages that we want to pick out and how will they land? And so that is really, really important. And sometimes they'll be quite, the end products will be quite different from the initial conversation, but that's the journey that sort of we take the project team on in terms of sort of achieving a good piece of PR. So sort of sometimes they might want to talk about something like a contract win or something, but actually the end result is talking about, going back to the previous discussion about social value, talking about sort of the impact a project will have on communities, because we know that for the media in that area, that's what they're interested in.
Right, thanks very much for that, Emily. Absolutely spot on as ever. Joe, if I can ask you a very similar thing about a lot of the work that possibly goes unseen. Now, I know that, for instance, your work as president of Women in Transport, I know you've recently had your parliamentary AGM, which we ran in Infrastructure Intelligence. I mean, can you describe the sort of work that goes on behind the scenes, dealing with policymakers, decision makers, influencers like that, to get like policy across? Because you're obviously looking at ways to, you know, basically encourage people to join the sector and transport and so forth. So if you can talk us through a little bit briefly about how, you know, the type of work that goes on behind the scenes to get that policies that the larger population can actually benefit from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would echo what others have said about it is a lot of what goes on behind the scenes and stuff that you stop happening. Particularly some of the roles I did at Transport for London, it's about knowing your stakeholders and knowing how they're going to react in certain situations. So that's quite important, and to make sure that comms is brought in at an early stage. In terms of the policy stuff with the APPG and Women in Transport, to get to that, and thank you for covering our AGM last week or the week before, but to get to that stage where you've got cross-party support, you know, it doesn't just happen by magic. You have to actually go out and talk to the parliamentarians and bring them on board. And Women in Transport and the need to have more women in a sector that is underrepresented, in a way it's an easy sell, but there's a lot of different campaigns that are all clamoring for MPs' attention. So you do have to do a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of researching which parliamentarians will be interested, building relationships for things that you're going to need in future. So yeah, that is all behind the scenes. And then people just see the press release in Infrastructure Intelligence and they say, oh, that's great, it's great to have that support. But yes, a lot of work has gone on behind the scenes, definitely.
Alicia, pretty much the same sort of question for yourself about the work that goes on behind the scenes, like a lot of the unseen work. I mean, do you think sometimes that there's often there can be sometimes maybe too much bureaucracy or something behind the scenes before something actually faces forward, you know, sort of again, and makes an impact with the public?
I wouldn't say there's too much bureaucracy. I mean, we have to get the messaging right, because, you know, we've seen how reputations are, you know, ruined in minutes from the wrong words, or someone tweeting something and having to delete it, and then their reputation. So I think actually that all that work is not bureaucracy at all. You have to get it right. But I think there's also that, just to cut from the others, that yes, okay, it could just be a press release that everyone else sees, but also the other things of what else that can stem off from that press release. So does that span into a STEM campaign, or a particular event that not many people will see unless they're going to that event? Does that turn then into another more marketing activity, or just the general relationship that you've built up with that client? So I think, yeah, there's not too much bureaucracy. I think we have to get it right from communications, but obviously get it right and know that we need to get it out timely as well, because otherwise it's past and it's not news anymore.
Good. James, I suppose you have like a similar feelings. I mean, the bulk of your work, if you're dealing with like government and influencing ministers and civil servants and stuff, a huge amount of unseen work that goes on there. But just moving on from that, rather than get you bogged down in that sort of government things, I'm just thinking, what advice would the panel give to the average engineer that probably doesn't see the need to shout from the rooftops about what they do? So, James, if I could possibly start with you on that one.
Yeah. So I think that I suppose there's two things, one at a personal level, one at a corporate level. Speaking about success and highlighting the success of the industry to wider stakeholders, one puts it on the map, which means that indirectly it's going to get much more attention. So if you can raise something up as an issue, you're more likely to get some of the policy outcomes that you want. So if construction is constantly in people's faces talking about the good work, then when it comes to trying to secure more funding or having those asks, actually it's a lot easier to get it back. And it goes back to that point I was making earlier. If you can talk about the added value stuff, the wider, 10% of workers or construction workers in this country make the economy, if you can talk about the wider benefits, what it's bringing in terms of infrastructure, all that kind of stuff, then it does make it easier that when you go in and ask for things, that you're more likely to get it back. And of course, if you're an employee business, then the knock-on effect of that is that you've got more security in job, more likely progression because the industry is booming. So I think it's twofold really. It's that corporate level and the personal level.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. Much appreciated. Emily, similar sort of thing, really. What advice would you give the average engineer that probably doesn't really see the need to shout from the rooftops about what they do?
First of all, I think there would be a conversation sort of around brand and sort of what are the bigger campaigns and messages from the company, and sort of talking about that and how their work fits into that, so that they see the sort of bigger picture. And I think what I was talking about in my opening presentation, that messaging isn't always siloed around one specific work stream, but it's often about the bigger picture as well. Often clients really like the work that we do as well, and we sort of are able to support their own messaging and their own campaigns, but just sort of via a slightly different route. So it might be, for example, that we offer the opportunity for a client to sort of get some publicity about the sort of technical excellence on a project. So often clients like it as well, and that's obviously always good for projects and engineers working on projects. And I think that the final thing I'd say is that we're quite lucky in the infrastructure sector that we've got lots of publications and generally quite supportive publications. So sort of I'd always encourage people to sort of be brave and take the opportunity to talk about what they're doing, because actually it's generally quite a supportive sector, I think, in terms of the media.
Right, let's have a look. Finally unmuted. There we go, back in the room. I mean, it's a good point. May as well, at this point, as good a point as any, to say that obviously here at Infrastructure Intelligence, we look to promote as much good news as we possibly can about the industry, and also the benefits of working within it as well. Speaking of which, one question that often comes up is that construction is sometimes not seen as a particularly sort of sexy or attractive industry for younger people to get to work in, especially among different minorities and women as well. So Joe, I mean, do you have any thoughts about how to make the industry appear as a more attractive place to work in, really?
Yes, I do, and I've done a lot of research on this, both with my consultancy and also with Women in Transport. And I think, so it does link to improving communications and engagement on construction projects, actually. because if you can get your comms and engagement top quality and reaching the widest audience possible, then you are going to open the industry up to women and other underrepresented groups and encourage them to consider careers in the sector. And then the other sort of practical things you can do to help to attract a more diverse workforce is to make sure you profile the wide range of people and roles that you have at all levels in your organization. So making sure you're profiling women, young apprentices, people from ethnic minority communities at all different job levels, because importantly, if we want to encourage people into the industry, they need to be able to see people like them doing the job. And schools engagement programs and schools outreach, really, really important. I know loads of people that have actually joined the industry because they were inspired to do so after hearing a presentation from an engineer or something like that when they were at school. So that schools outreach program really important as well.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for that fantastic point again. A question to all the panelists here, and then I'll kick off the final question for the morning. But basically, if a company, a smaller company in particular, doesn't have the resources of an ACOM or a Stantec, or a BECG, for instance, if a company isn't particularly talking about what they're doing, how can they embrace PR? Could it be that they get people around the table to talk about different things, to talk about what different people are doing? Do they use social media much at all? Or do they have a dedicated PR person? Or if not, why not? So if I can start that with by asking Alicia that, like, how can a small company embrace PR?
So I would say, from a client perspective, as I sort of said in my earlier bit about comms teams involvement, lean on the people that you're working with as well. Ask them if you can share resources, share media lists. If you're working on the same project, it makes complete sense to just ask. The worst they're going to say is no, and they're probably not going to say no. Social media is obviously key, and being at events, being there as visible as you possibly can. Social media where there's events where there's round tables, trying to get a freelance copywriter in to help write that up, and then pitch that. So I think there's a couple of ways.
Emily, same sort of question to you. How can a smaller company embrace PR?
I would completely agree with what Alicia's just said. Those are all really good points. If I was to add anything, I'd say play to your strength. If you're an SME, you're likely a very local employer, and therefore sort of you'll have a strong interest from the local media. And also, I think probably just before sort of embarking on any kind of PR or campaign, just rather than focusing on what you want to say, think about what you want to achieve. And I think sort of if you think about that, then that will very much direct sort of where you put your resources initially.
Hey, the mute button is now sorted. Yes. Sorry, James. Sorry, James, if I can ask you the same thing.
Yeah, sure.
How can small companies embrace PR, apart from obviously hire a wonderful PR agency such as yourselves or Joe or anyone here today?
So I think have a realistic, proactive plan that maximizes your results, and where you'll get that from is working out two things. One, where you're credible, so what's your knowledge base, what's your background, and that you can talk about with confidence. And second is likability. What do you enjoy talking about? If you can match those two things, then you'll be absolutely perfect at getting your message out in whatever channel.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, James. Now, one final question to end today's session, which goes to everyone. Basically, if you had one key message for the industry to take on board as a whole, one key message about the industry, about communications, what would it be? And I'll start with Emily on that one, I think. Emily.
I should think it's probably going to be a similar answer from everyone, so I don't want to take credit for this. I mean, it has to be just bring comms in as early as possible. That way, all the thought processes it can be gone through, enough time for planning, etc., etc., etc. So early inclusion of the comms team is essential, I think.
Absolutely, couldn't put it better myself. Alicia, same message. I would very similar message, I would imagine.
Yeah, similar message, but also then embed your comms teams in internally as well. Share the work what all the comms teams is doing internally. You know, team briefs, that sort of thing, newsletters, just to showcase all the work that's happening, as we discussed, all behind the scenes that people might not necessarily see. Showcase that work and then share best practice.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Alicia. Joe, similar question to you. What key message would you give to the industry in terms of comms, if we didn't already?
Yeah, well, couldn't agree more about bringing the comms team in early. And then also to make sure you engage early and often with the communities that you're working in, ensure local people have the opportunities to shape the project, and partner with supportive stakeholders to amplify your message.
Okay, thanks very much. And finally, James, what would your key message to the industry be?
Well, I agree with all of the statements that everyone's made. So mine would be, I think, have confidence that you have stories. You might not think you do, but there's definitely stories within every business that people will be interested in. So have confidence. And second to that is doing something is better than nothing. So get on it.
Thanks again, James. I'll have to sort this mute button out one sooner or later. But thanks. That's a fantastic way to end today's session. Simple message, right? Engage, get communications people involved as soon as possible, and then get on it. Marvelous rallying cry if ever there was one. Right. Well, basically, thanks to everyone who's joined us today for a very what I think has been a really insightful morning. Thanks to our partners. BECG. That's how to say that read, I think. And our panelists, obviously, Joe Field, Alicia De Haldivang, James Bird, and Emily Ashwell, for what's been another enjoyable and insightful morning. And we'll have a report on today's webinar up on our website, hopefully later today. Now we're back here at 11 o'clock, same time, Friday, 15th of July, about 3 weeks, I think that is, 4 weeks, for another webinar where we'll have another top fantastic lineup, looking at nature-based solutions and going beyond net zero. But for now, thanks for joining us this morning. I wish you all a fantastic weekend, and I hope the sun continues to keep shining wherever you are in the world. So that's all for me today and our panelists, and thanks very much for joining us, and I'll see you soon. Bye. Goodbye.